Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined again by Scott Ritter, a former U.S. Marine, a major, and a UN weapons inspector. So thank you for coming back on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So the INF Treaty from 1987, it eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons, well, that is missiles with the intermediate range of between 500 to 5,500 kilometers, and it was quite significant in terms of mitigating the security competition, indeed contributing also to negotiating an end to the Cold War. But in 2019, the US withdrew from it, although the Russians said they would not station any missiles which would have been in breach of the INF Treaty to avoid escalation unless the Americans did so. Now, Putin now announced that Russia will no longer abide by these self-imposed restrictions on the deployment of these intermediate range missiles, nuclear capable as well. Again, this seems to be very serious, and I thought, who better to ask than a former UN weapons inspector? So, why did Russia take this step, and what are the consequences?
Well, I'm not just a former UN weapons inspector. The reason why I was selected as a UN weapons inspector is that before that, I was an INF inspector. I worked for the On-Site Inspection Agency and was one of the initial cadre of inspectors to implement the INF Treaty. In fact, I was the first U.S. inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union when the treaty went into force back on July 1st of 1988. So I know this treaty inside and out. Um, and I also understand the importance of this treaty. Just a little bit of history. Intermediate range, forces have been part of the military reality of Europe for some time now. But they they weren't seen as, game changing. They were just part of an overall range of military options available to both sides of the military equation, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But the Russians had relatively older systems, the SS-4, the SS-5, liquid fueled systems that were not responsive to, emerging situations. They had other systems that they deployed later, like the SS-12, which was a solid rocket system, but it was a single warhead. It was seen more of being a glamorous Scud missile. The whole situation changed, however, in the late 1970s when Russia deployed this new missile, the SS-20, RS-10, the Pioneer. 3 warheads, road mobile, um, and just an absolute game changer. It guaranteed the physical destruction of Europe in case of any war between the Soviet Union and Europe, and there was nothing Europe could do to defend themselves from it. Um, and so this created sort of the ultimate form of deterrence. And from the European and American standpoint, the deployment by the Soviets of the SS-20 also created an imbalance when it comes to the pressure that can be placed on nations. The whole concept of nuclear deterrence is that no nation would be able to use its nuclear force to intimidate other nations to achieve certain geopolitical outcomes, because the other nations would have their own nuclear capabilities that could be used in retaliation. There was parity, mutually assured destruction, things of this nature. The SS-20 being a solid rocket system with the ranges that it had with multiple warheads, literally could blanket all of Europe with nuclear weapons, eliminating the totality of NATO's capability. And then the question comes from a NATO perspective: would the United States commit suicide on behalf of Europe? Meaning that if the Soviets took out NATO, would the United States implement Article 5, implement its nuclear doctrine, knowing that the Russians, the Soviets had their own strategic nuclear forces that would destroy the United States? Or would the United States, being confronted with this, say, well, so sad, too bad, wouldn't want to be a European today? And so that there needed to be a counter. And so the counter was the deployment by the United States in the early 1980s of its own intermediate range systems, the ground launched cruise missile and the Pershing II solid rocket missile. The Pershing II in particular was deemed to be very threatening to the Soviets because when launched from a position in West Germany, the Pershing II missile, nuclear capable, um, would be able to strike Moscow within 12 minutes, creating a potential decapitation scenario. And you combine that with what was going on in the further development of American strategic nuclear forces, namely the Ohio-class submarine armed with Trident um, nuclear-tipped missiles. Um, and if these Trident missiles came up close to the shore, they could launch a flat trajectory and do decapitation. You have a very dangerous situation where one mistake and the whole world ends. One mistake, one miscalculation, one misjudgment. And so the decision was made by both the United States and the Soviet Union that we needed to bring these systems under control. And through a negotiating process, they came up with the zero option, which means not just limiting the deployment and the numbers of INF and short range systems, but getting rid of them altogether. And this was the treaty that you mentioned. And it was a very successful treaty. Within 3 years of implementation, all of the INF systems possessed by the nations involved, the Soviet Union, the United States, were eliminated, gone. Um, and then we had an effective monitoring regime in place to ensure that these weapons never came back. Um, Fast forward, the inspection aspect of this treaty was 13 years in duration, and when that ended, there were no more physical inspections, but the treaty was still very much in play, in force, and what you had was monitoring using national technical means. Um, the the Russians had their concerns about American compliance. If you take a look at the development of our ballistic missile defense shield, um, that weapons that are used as the targets are intermediate range missiles, and they've been flight tested. They sort of technically violate the INF treaty, but the United States says, nah, it doesn't apply because these are targets, not real systems. But they simulate an INF system because they are an INF system. So the Russians had some issues, but the bigger issues came from the American side, where we had concerns about two particular systems in question. One was what we called the RS-26 or Rubiège. I guess the NATO designation at the time was SS-26X or something of that nature. This was a missile that was designed to fill the gap created by getting rid of the SS-20. Um, and the what you what the Russians were trying to achieve was a missile that didn't meet the INF threshold, that if it got launched, it would be under the INF range. And you could do that with certain warhead configurations. But if it was configured, for instance, with a single warhead or, more advanced avant-garde hypersonic reentry vehicle, it would fly to INF ranges and become covered by the INF treaty. So in 2017, the Russians put a stop to the deployment of this. It was done pretty haphazardly because they were getting ready to do under the treaty. They were going to get ready to do an inspection of this. I'm sorry, it wasn't short range. Under certain ranges, it could fly as a ICBM. It'd be counted as an ICBM, but if you had a different warhead configuration, it would count as an INF system. And the Russians didn't want to be seen as violating the INF treaty. This one wasn't really the game changer. The game changer came with a system known as the 9M 927, maybe. I could be off on this number, but it was basically a development of the Iskander M cruise missile that the United States claims the Russians tested as a ground launch cruise missile in violation of the INF treaty. The Russians say that this didn't happen. I've reviewed as much of the data as humanly possible and without having access to classified information. I'm convinced that the United States got it wrong on this one, that the Russians, the same design bureau that was doing the 9M 927 was doing the Caliber missile, which is a sea-launched missile. You're allowed to test sea-launched missiles from a ground station. the development of the caliber was taking place in parallel with the development of 9M 927. And I just believe the United States got it wrong, that we misread the intelligence. And, there might have been some compatibility of components of the missiles so that when things are being tested on a caliber, or if they were tested on the 9M 927, uh, they would, the U.S. intelligence, analysts could say, oh, that's really a cruise missile, a long range cruise missile. The Russians tried to assuage our concerns by holding a demonstration. They actually laid out the original 9M, the original Iskander M, and then they put this advanced. And what you see, it's the same booster, the exact same propulsion system. The only thing that changes is the warhead and the guidance package. And actually, with this new system, the warhead and the guidance packages are larger. So if you have a larger guidance package and a larger warhead, and you're using the same propulsion system, that means it's probably going to fly less than the range of the other system. And there are ways, that this could have been tested, but the United States wasn't interested in this because while Russia was doing everything possible to be compliant with the INF Treaty, the United States wasn't. We wanted out of this treaty, because not because of Russia per se, but because of China. China had developed a whole range of intermediate range systems that we believe gave China an advantage in any potential conflict in the Pacific, and we wanted something that would be able to counter the Chinese INF, but we couldn't do it because of the INF treaty we had with Russia. Um, we claimed that there were no violations, but there were. The Mark 41 Aegis Ashore system uses a containerized launch platform that on board an Aegis ship can not only fire the SM-3 or SM-6 surface-to-air missile, but also the ship-launched cruise missile. Now you take the same system and put it on the ground, and the Russians are like, well, you can launch ground-launched cruise missiles from here. And we said, oh, no, we're not going to do that. We're not interested in doing that. Don't worry about that. Well, 1 week after we pulled out of the INF Treaty, we tested the Aegis Ashore system using a ground-launched cruise missile. We're liars. We were planning on this all the time. Anybody who's been involved in ballistic missile testing knows that you don't gin up a test within a week, that we had been planning this test for some time now, and we're simply waiting to get out of the treaty to do this. So that's where we are today. There is no treaty and there is no trust between Russia and the United States. The Russians, again, they have better memories than we do. They understand the destabilizing aspect of these weapons. So the Russians told the United States that even though the treaty was no longer in force, it would not develop or deploy INF systems so long as the United States didn't deploy systems into the European theater. Well, a couple of years ago, the United States deployed one of these containerized systems into Denmark to participate in an exercise. The United States said, well, we only had the SM-6 missile in there, which is a short-range missile. But the Russians don't know that. It's a system capable of launching cruise missiles, having tested to fire a cruise missile. So the Russians have to assume the system, when deployed, has cruise missiles. And they said, well, you violated this. So they began developing missiles. At the same time, the United States was also pursuing the development and deployment of a new hypersonic intermediate range system called the Dark Eagle. And so now Russia's looking at a situation where the United States, by developing these systems and deploying these systems, was altering the balance of power in Europe, giving the United States hypersonic preemptive strike capabilities at a time when tensions between NATO and the United States were on the rise with Russia because of Ukraine. And the Ukraine conflict showed the importance of long-range strike systems. Just imagine putting Dark Eagle or putting the SM-6 Typhoon on Ukrainian soil and the kind of destabilization of impact that would have on Russia, which is one of the reasons why the Russians are fighting this war and ensuring that Ukraine never becomes part of NATO. But the Russians needed a counter, so they began development of at least one system, I believe more than one. And the system is a follow-on to the RS-26 Rubiage that we talked about. This is what we call the Oreshnik system. The Oreshnik is an amalgam of technologies using advanced solid rocket boosters borrowed from the Cedar ICBM, second stages borrowed from the YARS ICBM, a modified YARS M reentry vehicle, new warheads using new technologies. And it was tested, flight tested, and the Russians launched what they call an operational test of the Oreshnik in November of 2024, targeting the Dnipro factory in Dnipropetrovsk. Um, but even when they did that, they just were saying we have this capability, but they hadn't operationalized it as a weapon system. It was estimated they had between 4 and 6 additional Oreshniks in the pipeline to be used for testing, but that's not serial production. Um, but then again, the Russians said they're going to begin serial production of the Oreshnik. Well, recently, Vladimir Putin announced in the aftermath of a mean tweet exchange between Lindsey Graham and Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, in which Lindsey Graham threatened a decapitation strike against Russia, outright threatened the Russians, saying if you don't believe that Donald Trump's serious about his um, intent to punish Russia for failing to bend the knee to Trump's demands about a ceasefire, just ask the Ayatollah what happens, meaning that, ask the Iranian leader who was subjected to a decapitation strike during Israel's 12-day war, a decapitation strike that the United States knew about and facilitated with intelligence information. So that's a direct threat against the Russian government. Medvedev responded saying, we have the dead hand, so you'll die. The dead hand is an allusion to a Cold War era system, the perimeter. Remember when I talked about the Ohio-class submarine being moved up close with flat trajectories? This was a real problem. So the Russians developed the dead hand to ensure that if there was ever a decapitation strike and you took out the Russian leadership, a system was in place using a variety of sensors, radiation detection, seismic sensors, etc., and missiles equipped with a communication system that they would launch these missiles that would fly over Russian territory, broadcasting launch codes, and the totality of Russia's nuclear arsenal would be fired against the United States. So what Medvedev was saying is we have the dead hand. So why are you talking decapitation? Well, Trump didn't understand, and so he immediately ordered, this is the genius of Donald Trump, 2 Ohio-class submarines armed with Trident missiles closer to Russian shores. So if you're trying to convince the Russians that you're not looking to decapitate their leadership, the last thing you would do is deploy 2 Ohio-class submarines um, closer to Russian shores. And so the Russians now, because of all of this, have said, we have put Oreshnik in serial production, and we are beginning the active deployment of these systems, not just in Russia, but also in Belarus. Belarus is going to get a regiment, that's 9 launchers, of Oreshniks. The Oreshnik is a dual-capable system. It can fire a conventional warhead, or actually cluster warheads, or it can fire nuclear warheads. Um, the Oreshnik is that SS-20-like game-changing weapon. There is no analog in NATO. There's nothing that can counter it, nothing that can defeat it. And once the Oreshnik reaches full operational deployment, as Dmitry Medvedev said in a follow-on tweet, all of the cathedrals of all of the cities of Europe are now at risk because, like the SS-20, the Oreshnik will be able to blanket Europe with destructive power, conventional and nuclear, which gives it an added dimension of military flexibility. Now Russia can destroy all of Europe just using conventional weapons. They don't need nuclear weapons. And when we can thank Donald Trump for this. Dmitry Medvedev, in announcing this, he also alluded to other systems. And this is where we go back to the Cold War. In addition to the SS-20, the Russians were concerned about the Pershing II missile and its ability to strike Moscow. And so they wanted a counter to that. And they were developing a short-range system called the Skorost, or the quick missile. And the purpose of the Skorost was when Pershings were detected leaving their garrisons going to deployment areas, the Skorost could be rapidly sent to the field, fire, and take out the Pershing II. Right now, the Oreshnik, like the SS-20, is not that flexible in terms of its targeting. So if the United States deploys Dark Eagle to Germany, the Russians don't have the ability to interdict Dark Eagle with assurance of success. So I believe that, as was the case of pulling out, the RS-26 to create the Oreshnik, I believe that the Russians have pulled out Skorost and they're developing a follow-on system. And Medvedev said there are other systems in play. And when you look at the operational requirements facing the Russians and you mirror that with the operational requirements facing the Soviets back in the 80s, Skorost is an absolute necessity. So I think we're seeing that. And the Russians may come up with others. They had another system that was under development, the Courier small ICBM, actually ready to go into serial production, but was stopped back in 1991 by Gorbachev. And an interesting fact of history, the coup that was launched against Gorbachev in August of 1991 was triggered by Gorbachev signing an order ending the Courier small ICBM system. This created an economic crisis for the Ministry of Defense industry, and the other industries involved in this. That's when the head of the KGB got together with all these different ministers and said Gorbachev's got to go. But that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That shows you how important these missile systems are to Russia overall.
Well, there seems to be a lot of incremental escalation on the nuclear front. That is, the U.S. is supposed to station these new long-range precision missiles in Germany next year. We have the Golden Dome, and of course, a few weeks ago, this attack on Russia's nuclear forces, which was met with joy, mockery, if not celebration, from the political media establishment across the West. And there's also this tendency, at least in Europe, to start to dismiss Russia's nuclear deterrent by essentially rejecting it as nuclear blackmail. The best thing we can do is pretend it's not there or ignore it, which is a very strange social constructivist approach to nuclear security. But is this the Oreshnik, the introduction of it, especially now that it's going under serial production? Why is it changing wars or changing the balance of power in Europe? Is it because it also, I guess, allows a different step on the escalation ladder? So it's not either conventional war or, nuclear war, we end the world. Because what often makes nuclear weapons less credible as a deterrent is that they're so destructive. But is this the secret of the Oreshnik, that it's this middle step?
Yeah, it provides the Russians with the ability to dramatically escalate without using nuclear weapons. And so if you're looking at to give you an example, let's say that Germany did use the Taurus missile, gave it to Ukraine, and it struck Moscow. And let's say Moscow followed up by attacking the Dusseldorf production facility of Rheinmetall and maybe some other places. Right now, it would have to strike using, air-launched missiles like the Kinzhal, maybe Iskanders, but there are limitations to what Russia can do, and the strike it's not decisive enough to deter Europe, and so Europe will then begin an escalation ladder that would lead to nuclear. If you're going to escalate, you want to escalate in a way that just intimidates the crap out of the person you're escalating against. So now imagine the following, that Russia fires the Oreshnik and totally eliminates Dusseldorf, hits Ramstein, eliminates that, and then demonstrates that it has 100 Oreshniks ready to blanket all of Europe instantly, and there's nothing Europe can do to defend themselves. Does Europe now go to nuclear weapons? Do they go up to that step, or will there be pressure put on Europe to say, back down? The Oreshnik is a game changer because it puts all of Europe at risk. The United States just deployed B-61 12 bombs to England. The Oreshnik will take out that site within 15 minutes of being launched. It won't exist. There's some speculation that the Oreshnik that was used against Dnipro was a version that had it was a test warhead. And what I mean by that is, while the submunitions were coated or manufactured out of this new exotic ceramic alloy, there was no explosive material inside. So basically, these were duds that hit the ground. And one of the reasons the Russians did that is to disguise the true destructive capacity of Oreshnik. because the Russian sources that I've spoken to have said that the true destructive capacity of Oreshnik is far different than what was demonstrated. And that the Oreshnik, when fired, let's say you take a battalion of Oreshniks, that's 3 Oreshnik missiles, that's sort of 108 submunitions, and that you bring those down in a concentrated area. They say that the damage done is the equivalent of a nuclear weapon. And now if the Russians are deploying, I don't know, 10 regiments of Oreshnik, each regiment has 3 battalions. You see where I'm going on this? Europe doesn't stand a chance, literally. It was the dumbest move in the world was to get out of the INF Treaty, and the second dumbest move in the world was to provoke the Russians. Now the Russians have, taken this step. How do we get out of this mess? It's a huge arms control problem, a huge arms control problem. Unfortunately, I don't think we're getting out of it unless we replicate the sense of urgency that came from the 1980s, where, there was a crisis, crisis mentality that if we don't sign this treaty, we are all going to die. We need the West to feel the urgency, and that means the West has to deploy systems that make Russia feel at risk. And then now there's a joint reason for both nations to get rid of. The Pershing II is what made the Russians get rid of the SS-20. Is Dark Eagle going to be the system that makes Russia get rid of Oreshnik? I don't know. Does Russia want to get rid of Oreshnik? The thing about the INF Treaty, and one of the reasons why I talked about the Courier small ICBM, is we in the West speak about the INF Treaty as if this is a great thing. Arms control. We began the process, and as you said, it began a process that ended the Cold War. Most of the Russians don't view it that way. The Russians say it began a process that brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the weakening of Russia. From the Russian perspective, the INF Treaty gutted Russia's military capabilities by getting rid of 3 systems produced in Vodkinsk: the SS-20, the SS-12, and the SS-23. It also led to the START Treaty, which brought limits to the production of SS-25, which was the system, and the Courier, the small ICBM, was eliminated. This was economically devastating for the city of Vodkinsk, which is, all intents and purposes, a factory town. They get paid by the missile. And when you come in and you eliminate all of their missile production severely, except one, and you severely reduce the numbers of missiles being produced, they went from producing 60 to 80 SS-25s a year to producing 6 SS-25s a year. They didn't produce, they were producing, 100 SS-20s a year, maybe less, but, 80 to 100 to 0. SS-12s, 0. SS-23s, 0. And, it's economically devastating. And that resonates across all of the military towns where these generals and these ministers get their power. This, their ability to influence. Nothing happened in Vodkinsk without the Vodkinsk machine building plant, the Vodkinsk factory, saying it was going to happen. They built the schools, they built the roads, they built the hospitals, they built the markets, they brought in the food. It was the Director General of Vodkinsk in as late as 1976 or 78 that brought natural gas to Vodkinsk. Remember, Vodkinsk is out in the middle of nowhere, 700 and some odd miles away from Moscow in the foothills of Ural Mountains. There was no natural gas. So the citizens of Vodkinsk suffered through some of the coldest winters imaginable. It was the director who went out there and took the profits from the factory, tapped into the big pipeline, personally overseeing that, putting his life at risk because it's very difficult to tap into a functioning gas pipeline. But they did it, and they brought gas to Vodkinsk. The factory was the city, was the life. And it's not just in Vodkinsk, but in other cities across. And when I go in and I talk about the validity of the INF Treaty, the Russians are like, we hate that treaty. We hate arms control because A, it brought down the Soviet Union, and B, it made us weak because you guys cheat, you guys lie. The INF Treaty was the one pure treaty while it was being implemented. Both sides benefited. But look at what the United States did later on. We used the INF Treaty to promote the unilateral advantage of the United States. And that's what the Russians accuse us of doing with strategic arms reductions as well, cheating. And we do. We're cheaters, straight up cheaters. We cheat in a sly way by not being honest in our negotiations. We claim to want one thing, we do another. Look at ballistic missile defense in 2008 when it was being negotiated, 2008, 2009, when it was being negotiated. The Russians said it has to be done in the context of missile defense. You can't have a strategic arms reduction treaty without missile defense. And the Obama administration, it took over from Bush, said, no problem, we'll do that. But we got to do it separately. Anatoly Antonov at the time was the lead negotiator. He said that he was assured by Rose Gutemiller that they would deal with this separately. They signed the treaty, it was implemented. But when Antonov called up Gutemiller and said, I'm ready to move forward on a missile defense, he said, we're not doing that. We lied. We straight up lied. And so this is what makes Oreshnik even more dangerous, is that the normal mechanisms that could be used to mitigate the danger from the system don't exist. There are no arms control talks taking place today. The New START Treaty expires in February of next year. When it expires, we're going to instantly go from 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads on each side to around 4,000 to 5,000 because we're going to bring the reserve warheads out, and then we're going to start manufacturing new pits, new weapons. We're going to get back up to 20 to 30,000 strategic nuclear forces per side. That's Cold War level madness. This is how dangerous this Oreshnik thing is. It's a very dangerous situation.
I think this was a problem with the hegemonic era, though. There's no incentive for mutual constraints when one side dominates, and arms controls tend to suffer often if you don't have any balance of power. Anyways, Scott Ritter, thank you so much. It's a frightening time that arms control is not taken more serious than this, and one hopes that we get a grasp on it soon before, as you said, especially in February, things might really go out of control. So something good could come out of this, though, if it does incentivize both sides now to start to rethink about the weapons that could kill us all. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me.